Please be seated. The court is now in session. Ms. Sakalwati, could you report the attendance of the parties and individuals to today's proceeding? Sakalwati, Mr. President, all parties to today's proceeding are present. As for Nuon Chia, he is present in the holding cell downstairs. That is based on the decision of the trial chamber due to his health. The expert who is going to continue to testify, that is Mr. Short, he is present in the courtroom. Thank you. President, thank you. The floor is now given to the prosecution to commence putting questions to this witness, this expert. You may proceed. Wayne Hood. Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, everyone in and around the courtroom. Good morning, Mr. Short. My name is Wayne Hood. I'm representing the office of the co-prosecutors. I have some questions for you. My questions are related to the policies of the Communist Party of Cambodia as well as its ideology. After I conclude my portion, my colleague, Mr. Tariq Abdul Haq, will focus on the historical development and evolution of these policies. My questions are mainly based on portions of your book, which is entitled Pol Pot, The Anatomy of a Nightmare. The document has a code name E3/9 as indicated by Judge Cartwright yesterday. As your book has not been translated into the Khmer language, I would use the English and the French reference of your book. You described in your book the significance of the decisions which, according to your book, were made in May 1975 at the Silver Pagoda. That is pages 8 and 9 of your book, with the EIN in English 003962000201. The French EIN is 0063 9460. For that portion you wrote, quote, "In this surreal setting, the arbiters of the world's most radical revolution took the fateful decision. After 10 days of discussion, to disband the so-called United Front with Sihanou's supporters and other non-communist groups. who had helped them to win power, to jettison the relatively moderate policies that such an alliance implied, and instead to make the leap, the extremely marvelous, extremely wonderful, prodigious leap, as the Khmer expression has it, to install in one fell swoop full communism without compromise or concessions. The die had been cast. And on page 12, that is English EN 00396204, and EN in French is 00639465. Jew wrote, quote, "In any violent upheaval, whether war or revolution, innocent people suffer. U.S. officials speak of collateral damage. Maoists talk of breaking eggs in order to make an omelette. In democratic Cambodia, collateral damage knew no bounds. Everything outside the revolution became a legitimate and necessary target. It was not simply that life had no value, that killing became an act of no consequence. An entire country was put in thrall to a dystopian ideal that negated anything and everything that was human." End of quote. I have a number of questions here for you, Mr. Short. First, can I ask you to expand on your use of the term, quote, "the world's most radical revolution," end of quote?
No other communist party anywhere, neither in North Korea, nor in China, nor in any of the Soviet bloc states, has attempted to go so quickly and so completely towards a communist state as defined by Marx, true communism, a state of complete equality, and indeed a state where the apparatus of the state withers away. One of the characteristics of democratic Cambodia was that the government apparatus, and indeed the apparatus of the party, were reduced to a minimum, where there was no compromise with realities in terms of creating this equal, propertyless, in the sense of private property, polity. In that sense, Pol Pot and the Cambodian Communist Party pushed the logic of communism to its extreme. And the result, as you know, was a terrible catastrophe.
In your opinion, and based on your research into the history of the movement, did the decisions made in May 1975 represent a significant departure from past practices? Or was there any relationship between the May 1975 decisions and CPK policies and practices that had been in existence in the liberated areas in the early 1970s?
If you look at the development of China after 1949, the first stage was what Mao called New Democracy, where the Communist Party cooperated with non-communist elements, with private business, and for 5 or 6 years there was what one might term a very moderate form of communism. It then became more radical and more extreme. In Cambodia, the decision taken in May was not to do that. Was it ever a serious option that the Cambodian Communist Party could have practiced the equivalent of New Democracy? That is, was it ever a serious option that the DK regime could have cooperated with non-communist elements? I think not, because precisely of the development before. Already in the provinces there were examples of a transition to an essentially property-less society. Money had been done away with. That is, the currency of the Long Nol government was not used. There was a degree of collectivization. There were steps in that direction. What the May meeting decided was that the leap into what one might call pure communism, utopian communism, should be direct and immediate. And I think that was not necessarily, that need not have been the case. There could have been a more gradual transition, even if the goal would always have been the same.
Based on your response, I take it that the May 1975 decisions meant there was still a relationship and practices since the early 1970s. Am I correct on this point? Allow me to repeat my question based on your response. I take it that based on your response, the decisions made in May 1975 followed the practices since early 1970s. Am I correct on this point?
Yes, I was waiting to answer, but I could not answer until the microphone switches on. Yes, you are correct. There is definitely a relationship between what happened after April 1975, including the decisions at the Silver Pagoda, and what had happened before. But it was not a fatal connection. it didn't have to happen in quite the way it did. Certainly, it would have happened eventually because that was the direction in which Khmer Rouge policy was pointing, but it didn't have to happen so fast. That was a decision that they took.
Thank you, Mr. Short.
នៅលើសេចក្តីថ្លែងការណ៍របស់លោកដែលថាអ្វីៗទាំងអស់
In the book you wrote, quote, everything outside the revolution became a legitimate and necessary target, end of quote.
តើខ្ញុំសួរថាតើសេចក្តីសម្រេចនេះ
Allow me to ask you first, what, if any, implications did this direction have on the relationship between the CPK and its former front allies?
The decisions taken in May meant that the front was essentially no longer useful. So the question then became, how does the CPK govern or manage its relations with the front? How does it bring that stage of the revolution to an end and start, as it did in 1976, the pure DK system? Because Sihanouk represented those who were outside the revolution. Prince Sihanouk, the members of the front, those who were not from the CPK core. So the decision to leap towards a radical communist state meant that that would all have to come to an end.
Also, regarding that decisions, that is the decision to smash. So the question that I really would like the response from you is whether that decision had any relationship between its former allies?
Yes, indeed. The former allies being those who were non-communist elements in the front. The decisions in May, the consequence of the decisions in May was that relationship should not continue as it had. It had to be changed because all power would be in the hands of the CPK core. And it no longer needed to be dressed up as a front with non-communist elements. So the destitution of the decision to promulgate a new constitution, which was taken at the end of 1975, and the consequences of that constitution, which were Sihanouk resigned, the front ended, that all followed from the decisions in May.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Now move on to another question. I'd like to understand more about the policy, that is this policy to smash. Did this policy affect ordinary people outside the party ranks? That's the first point. And secondly, did this policy in any way affect those within the ranks?
The policy to smash was to smash those who were not wholeheartedly with the revolution was, if you like, a corollary, a parallel facet to what we have just been discussing, the fact that people outside the revolution, people in the front, were no longer necessary for the next stage. Now, why were people smashed? Why were people suspected? I think you touch there on one of the very fundamental aspects of Khmer Rouge ideology. Individualism, asking questions about the regime, was a form of mental private property because it meant you had your own personal ideas which were different from those of the organization, different from those of Ankar. And private property, whether mental or material, was a sign of potential opposition, of being outside the revolution, of being part of them, those outside, rather than us within. So any kind of questioning, of showing of private views, of personal views, was taken to be in opposition to the revolution, whether at the highest levels or lower down or among ordinary people. And because this was a revolution which refused to admit doubt or uncertainty, those who showed different views, private views, as against the collective view, were liable, in the end, to be smashed.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Now, coming back to your book, and it is in the same section we looked at earlier, you deal with the abolition of individual rights under the regime. That is on page 11 of your book, English EAN 00396203. French EAN is 00639462, says the prosecutor. You wrote, quote, money, law courts, newspapers, the postal system and foreign telecommunications, even the concept of the city were all simply abolished. Individual rights were not curtailed in favor of the collective, but extinguished altogether. Individual creativity, initiative, originality were condemned per se. Individual consciousness was systematically demolished. End of quote. My question is the following. In your expert opinion, what was the policy reason for the abolition of extinguishing individual rights?
Because if you have individual rights, like individual opinions, like individual property, people are not equal. And I didn't have this from Mr. Khieu Samphan himself, but I talked to an official of actually the present government, who attended a seminar given by Mr. Khieu Samphan, at which he said that if one person had a little more and another person a little less, that was not communism. The only way to ensure communism, the implication at least, was that everyone must have the same, and that meant everyone having nothing in terms of private property. Now, that was applied mentally as well as in terms of material possessions.
Thank you, Mr. Short.
ខ្មែរក្រហមខ្ញុំសួរថាតើខ្មែរក្រហមមានវិធីអ្វីខ្លះសម្រាប់ជីវិតគ្រួសារ
What was the approach of the Khmer Rouge to family life, and in particular the right for families to stay together and for children to be with their parents?
The fundamental position was that the true family was the organization and not the nuclear family of parents, grandparents, and children. Therefore, family relations within the family, I don't want to be too dogmatic about this, because there were great differences depending on where you lived in Cambodia and what policies were followed by the local officials. But insofar as there was a central line, it was that family ties must not be allowed to interfere with the greater loyalty of each individual, each person, to the communist cause, to the organization ANCA. The result was that very little weight was placed on family relations, to the extent that marriages which took place under the Khmer Rouge period were often between soldiers, let us say, and young women, essentially for the practical purpose of creating children which would form part of the population. The romantic attachment between a couple was something that the Khmer Rouge had very little time for.
Continuing on this theme, I would like to explore the abolition in relation to what you have written in your book of courts or legal system under the 1975 to 1979 regime. Yesterday, Judge Cartwright asked you the question, and you said that the court of law was completely abolished at 1:45 second at yesterday. So now I would like to ask you to expand on this. Have you ever been able to form a view as to why CPK policy warranted the abolition of law courts?
Yes, I have. And I would like to say that it seems to me that the abolition of law courts was completely logical in terms of CPK policy. Because the only purpose of a law court is to judge independently. The idea of anything being independent of the party was abhorrent to the CPK. Therefore, why have law courts? The party itself would decide, and anything else would be hypocritical. Law courts only make sense in a totally different kind of democratic system. So, no courts.
Thank you, Mr. Short. I have an additional question on this particular theme. In the absence of the law courts, did any system of justice replace the law courts? And what were the hallmarks of that system?
I think in the terms which we would normally use, it would be difficult to apply the word justice. There was a system whereby those who were suspected of disloyalty would be denounced to the village or the collective leaders, and would often be taken to the district prison. In some cases, they might be released if it were felt by those running the prison that there were no, that they were not irredeemably guilty, that they need not be killed. In many cases, they would simply be killed. In some cases, the decision would be taken at the collective level, and they would be killed without being taken to the district prison. In yet other cases, they might be sent to S21, to Phnom Penh, to the center of the Santibal, and there they would be interrogated and then killed. I'm not sure that you can really call this a system of justice. It was a system of elimination of those on whom suspicion had fallen. But no more than that.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Now I would like to turn to a concept. I think you are an expert. You will be able to explain this based on your extensive research. Can you explain some of the various reasons below, as belows? If the entire country, the leadership fail to uphold the system of justice, or they allow the abolition of the law courts, what would be the consequences of the abolition of such justice system?
The consequences are what we saw, but again, I would say, given the ideology of the Cambodian Communist Party, it was both to be expected and flowed naturally from the guiding ideology. That is, you had a system where there was considerable arbitrariness at the lower levels in the provinces, but where all decision-making regarding the country as a whole was taken by a very small group of people in the Standing Committee, and essentially by Pol Pot himself, Nguyen Chia, and one or two others, depending on the subject.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Now I would like to turn to the issue concerning the abolition of money. Yesterday, Judge Cartwright asked you this question, and you responded. Concerning the abolition of money, the people in general could not do anything. That's what you told the court. So what I would like to expand on this particular issue, which I am not sure, and I need your enlightenment. I would like to know what policy or ideological considerations underpin the decision by the Khmer Rouge leadership to abolish money after victory and to establish a system of cooperatives and enforce collectivization.
I think the two issues are different. Collectivization happened in all communist countries to a greater or lesser degree. It did not, outside democratic Cambodia, it did not mean that money would be abolished. There was in China some very brief discussion of abolishing money during the Great Leap Forward at the end of the 1950s. They decided not to do it. Throughout the Chinese communist regime and every other communist regime, money has been used. So why in Cambodia, in democratic Kampuchea, did they decide to abolish money? Because, as I said earlier, private property of any kind is a source of inequality. And if, as one of your guiding principles, you are committed to absolute equality, it follows that money should not be used internally, because then one person has a little more, another has a little less. They can buy different amounts of different products, and inequality follows. So if you're being completely single-minded in a kind of tunnel vision way, you say no money, no private property, complete equality. They were logical with themselves. That's what they did, but at the cost of enormous suffering, because people could not live anything remotely like normal lives.
I have another question concerning the decision relating to the establishment of a system of cooperatives and enforced collectivization. Judge Lavange yesterday put this question to you, and yesterday you also explained in relation to this aspect that the establishment of this system was to ensure equality. Now, for example, if we want it to be ironed out in the same level to ensure social equality, I would like to ask you to explain, following the establishment of a system of cooperatives, what are the rationale behind the establishment of this system of cooperatives and collectivization?
Initially, there were a whole series of reasons. In communist systems, collectively owned property is held to be more just, better for everybody concerned than private ownership and the exploitation of man by man, as in a, inverted commas, capitalist system. There was also the practical rationale, which we discussed yesterday, of controlling the rice supply, preventing it being available to their Vietnamese allies, allies with problems. And then the is also the ideological element which we've just been discussing, the desire to produce a system in which everybody was equal, which was not, I mean, there were good reasons, or at least worthy motives for it. It would raise up the poorest peasantry, which again, as we heard yesterday, Pol Pot wished to make out were the majority of Cambodians. That was not true, but it was a justification advanced. And in the communist system, as they conceived it, agricultural production was going to be the way in which democratic Kampuchea developed, became prosperous and strong, and therefore the more people who could be put into collectives and made to work on the farms, the more agricultural production there would be, the stronger, the more quickly a strong Cambodia would develop. Again, if I might just add one word, this was not illogical. There was a great deal that made sense in this. The problem, the greatest problem, was in the way it was carried out. I mean, it is possible to imagine that a system of this kind could have been just and fair and equitable and would have achieved many of its goals without the suffering that resulted from the way it was carried out.
I have one last question for you. Just now we were discussing on the establishment of the policy of money abolition and the draft policy to establish a system of cooperatives and enforced collectivization. So how soon after the 17th of April 1975 was this new policy implemented?
Not in terms of the abolition of money, but in terms of collectivization and the mass population movements into collectives. That happened immediately. As soon as the Khmer Rouge had attained victory, all the cities were evacuated. People were put to work in collectives. The abolition of money, that decision was much slower. It's very difficult to pinpoint quite how it went. The fundamental decision was taken in May at the Silver Pagoda, but there was already at that time there were already moves to put into place a banking system which would have allowed money to be used. And as I think we said yesterday, specimen notes were taken to at least some collectives to be shown to people, this is the money that we're going to use. Was it in June that the word finally got round that no money's going to be used? I don't know. It's hard to pinpoint that to a very precise date. The decision was taken in May. So after that, it was finished. But it probably took some weeks before the effects of that decision were made completely known everywhere.
Mr. Short, thank you very much. I would like to conclude my line of questioning now, but I hand over the floor to my esteemed colleague, Mr. Tariq Abdul Haq, to pursue the question. Thank you, Mr. President. I have no further question for now.
Good morning, Mr. President and Your Honours. Good morning, Council, and a very good morning to you, Mr. Short. Let me express on behalf of the prosecution team our gratitude for you coming to Cambodia to testify. We appreciate this is your second trip. On the first occasion, we weren't very lucky. I'm going to be ambitious and cover a rather wide range of topics with you today and tomorrow morning. And we'll be going as far as one can chronologically through development of some of the policies that you've been describing. But I thought I'd start first just by picking up on one or two points that you've just been explaining while these matters are still fresh in our mind. You talked about the concept of the destruction of I think you called it mental private property. And in that context, or in a different question, you discussed a education session that Q Sampan gave that was described to you by an individual you interviewed. And I want to read to you a quote from the book and see if this is relevant and if this is indeed the passage you had in mind. So this is at page 316 of the book, the lower half of page 316. The English ERN is 003965224. French ERN 0063870. And this is that quote. Exactly what was involved in changing your mentality was made clear to the new arrivals at a month-long seminar conducted by Q Sampan. And then you quote the words attributed to him. How do we make a communist revolution? He asked us. The first thing you have to do is to destroy private property. But private property exists on both the material and the mental plane. To destroy material private property, the appropriate method was the evacuation of the towns. But spiritual private property is more dangerous. It comprises everything that you think is yours. And then a little bit further down, the next subparagraph, the knowledge you have in your head, your ideas, are mental private property too. To become a true revolutionary, you must wash your mind clean. That knowledge comes from the teaching of the colonialists and imperialists, and it has to be destroyed. Is that the passage you had in mind before we move on to other questions?
It is indeed. Yes.
And if I can just read another passage that follows on after this quote. You state, Sampan cautioned them that they should keep these ideas to themselves, because if the masses knew what we had been discussing, they might become discouraged. I should say, for the context, I think you placed this event in late 1975. It was an educational session given to returning intellectuals. And perhaps you can correct me if I've got the date wrong. Can I ask you this, and perhaps you have already touched on this, but while we're dealing with the specific quote, why was it so important to keep these ideas to themselves? Why couldn't these ideas be communicated to the masses?
This is part of I was going to say the general thing of secrecy. Secrecy was one of the key principles of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. Knowledge was only for those who needed to have it. And right the way through, right up to the end, the Vietnamese invasion and the flight of the Khmer Rouge from Phnom Penh, everything they did was marked by extraordinary secrecy. So the fact that Khieu Samphan said, no, keep this to yourselves, don't tell the masses, whether it was because the masses would be discouraged, that I think is less important. The point is, keep it to yourselves, do not let it out. That's absolutely fundamental to everything they did.
So if I understand you correctly, the instruction or the request is in furtherance of a policy or a line of the party. And correct me if I've got that wrong.
I suppose you could say a policy, a line, a guiding principle would be the best, I think.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that. Now, as I said, we are going to try and deal with things chronologically in trying to understand in a bit more detail the development of policies and structures of the CPK. So I'm going to take us right back to 1960, and your book is extremely detailed in this period. There are a lot of very interesting developments that you describe. But just by way of a very, very brief overview, and you will correct me if I've got this wrong, but from approximately 1950 onwards, a communist, you describe the development of a communist movement within Cambodia under the general sponsorship of the Vietnamese, and you describe the various committees, the city committees that existed throughout the 1950s, the Urban Committee and the Phnom Penh Committee, and in fact you describe that Pol Pot and Nuon Chea both joining, I believe, the Urban Committee in 1955. You then describe the Congress, the September 1960 Congress, and the reason I start here is because I think you describe it as a significant event, as an event that presents a number of important decisions. And if I can quote here from the book, this passage starts from page 137, and then it follows on the next 2 pages of your book. The ERNs in English, 00396 337, in French, 00639 617. And you described a gathering of 21 delegates at the home of an individual called Ok Sukun. And you state that they met for 3 days, and that during that time they remained all in the one place. And I'll quote you here as to the importance of this meeting. Quote, "But the program approved by the meeting marked a crucial first step towards an independent political line. The feudal ruling class led by Sihanouk, they declared, far from playing a positive role, as the Vietnamese argued, was the most important enemy of the Kampuchean Revolution and a tool of the American imperialists. The plight of the Cambodian people was 2 or 3 times worse than before 1955, when Hanoi had imposed the policy of cooperating with Sihanouk. Cambodians would therefore have to struggle to annihilate the feudal regime, peacefully or otherwise." Can I ask you to expand on the significance of this decision, and in particular in light of the point you make that Hanoi had in fact imposed a different policy, a policy of cooperating with Sihanouk?
This whole period, and I don't want to get ahead of your questioning, but right from the start with the Isarak rebellion against the French in the late 40s, right the way through to the late 60s, is a period of a very gradual, step-by-step disengagement by the Cambodian communists from the Vietnamese. And the reason, two main reasons. First of all, the Vietnamese wished to be seen and regarded themselves as elder brothers, bringing on the younger Cambodian brothers and controlling what they did. And right up to 1960, that essentially remained the case. It began to change in 1960 when the Cambodians held their own Congress without inviting Vietnamese delegates, without telling the Vietnamese party what they were doing. That was a crucial first step towards the independence of the Cambodian Communist Party. The second element was that the Vietnamese and the Cambodians had very different interests. For the Vietnamese, Sihanouk, who was neutralist, who was sympathetic, and indeed at many times, many points in that period, fundamentally believed that whatever the Americans might do, the Vietnamese communists were going to win, and he had to make policy accordingly. So for the Vietnamese, Sihanouk was objectively an ally, a very useful person to have. For the Cambodian communists, Prince Sihanouk and his government, which increasingly restricted any possibility of opposition, of legitimate legal opposition, that regime was the enemy. So you had two different approaches, two different sets of interests.
Thank you, and I think we will return to that theme, this divergence that you're describing. Another quote from that same section, and if you're looking at the hard copy, this will be at page 138. You describe the election of a new leadership, and you say the following: the Congress elected a new leadership. Tu Samut became secretary, with Nunchia as his deputy, and Salat Sa in the third-ranking position. All three were full members of the Standing Committee. Ieng Sary, whose only real qualification was to have headed the Cercle Marxiste in Paris, was promoted over the heads of the former resistance leaders to become fourth in the hierarchy. A striking demonstration of the growing power of the returned students. And that last part is what I'm particularly interested in, because you discussed yesterday the importance of intellectuals within the leadership of the party. Does this rise or a growing influence that you describe, growing power of the returned students, is this a significant point in time where that begins to be seen, or does that happen at some other point in time?
I think it's fair to say this was one of the one of the significant periods or occasions where one saw the returned students become more important. Because in the 1950s, the party was still essentially former Isaraks. Tu Samut, in countryside, people like Kai Pok, So Pum. Now we get to 1960 in the Standing Committee, the three full members. There is no Isarak leader. Tu Samut, yes, but then Nguyen Chia was from the very small group of Thai-trained Cambodian communists. Pol Pot, a returned student. Ieng Sary, a returned student. And really only one rural warlord, So Pum. So the balance is already changing, and it would change further, though there would always be these, you can say, three groups, essentially two groups. Later they were called the brick houses and the thatched houses. In other words, the urban returned students and the Isarak from the countryside, plus Nguyen Chia and one or two others who didn't have very much significance, who were the Thai group, but was very tiny.
Thank you. And while we're dealing with this period, you don't date this particular event, but I gather from the context that it would be late 50s and early 60s. We're looking here at page 132 of the book, and the ERNs are in English 00396-332, French 00639-611. You're dealing here with the activities of Khieu Samphan in the period, and what is of some relevance to our present discussion is that you say the following, quote, with Sari's encouragement, he had followed Hu Yun's example and joined the San Kun. But then, to the dismay of his elderly mother, who expected him to begin a lucrative career as a high official, he invested his savings in a stock of lead type and began producing a twice-weekly broadsheet. And then this, his assignment from the underground Phnom Penh City Committee was to rally intellectual support and reach out to potential communist sympathizers in mainstream political life. It was a role to which Samphan was well suited. Do I understand correctly from that passage then that, and you will correct me on the timing of things if I've got this wrong, that late 50s perhaps following Khieu Samphan's return, or early 60s, based on your research, facts you've gathered, there was already contact between Khieu Samphan and that underground Phnom Penh City Committee?
Yes, we're talking early 60s, right at the beginning of the 1960s. And yes, there was contact. Now, direct contact, with whom, how, that's a very different question, because there are, in the Sihanoukist weekly Réalité Cambodgienne, there is an extraordinary description of how, during that sort of time, the Communist City Committee, Vaughan Vett in particular, disguised his contacts through very large numbers of intermediaries. So direct contact one can't say, but certainly indirect contact. And if I might just add, there's a little bit you didn't read that followed. It said Khieu Samphan was well suited for this role. He was an idealist in whom personal morality and social conscience were indissolubly linked. And I think that is, I'm going slightly outside your question, but it seems to be important. Khieu Samphan was, no, that still is, rigid, doctrinaire, but very consistent. He was, at that time, an upright man, and he continued to hold, without asking himself too many questions, to what he believed in. Now, without asking himself very many questions, of course, is the downside of those characteristics I've described.
Thank you. But to confirm, we sort of focused on the mode of contact, but I did understand correctly then from that passage that there was assignment given to him from this underground city committee.
Yes, you did, and apologies for my digression.
Not at all. Your book is full of extremely interesting detail, and I regret to have to skip some of it, but we're trying to be as economical as we can with the time and just hit on the main events to the extent that we can. I'm going to fast forward then to 19 1964, and you're looking at the hard copy, so at this point we're at page 146, you had already testified yesterday about the initial change of name, so that has already happened at this point in time. The reason I pause at this point and want to ask you a couple of questions is because you're describing perhaps a shift or a further movement in this move towards a freedom from Vietnamese control, and you will correct me if I'm summarizing these things wrong. At this point, of course, 1964, some of the leaders have already fled Phnom Penh and they're in Vietnam. So looking at page 146, the ERNs being 00396-346 in English and 00639-630 in French. It's essentially the first Central Committee meeting since 1963. And you say the following: the first concrete sign of that being an independent stance, came in the autumn when an enlarged plenum of the Central Committee, the first such meeting the Cambodians had ever held, took place in a forest on the Cambodian side of the border. It lasted several weeks and ended by producing a draft resolution which endorsed all forms of struggle, including armed violence, against Sihanouk's government, and emphasized self-reliance, the Khmer's code word for freedom from Vietnamese control. And just to be complete, I will read from the next page, where that draft resolution was put in its final form. You say the following: in January 1965, the Central Committee met again to put the resolution into its final form. The version approved by this second plenum attacked modern revisionism, meaning Khrushchev's ideas about peaceful transition to socialism, and affirmed the role of revolutionary violence in the struggle against imperialism and its lackeys. To the Khmers, Sihanouk was just such a lackey, a chieftain of the feudalists and imperialists, wreaking terror on the Cambodian people. Does this represent a significant development? Is it a shift or a further movement towards a policy of independence? I'll start with that first.
It's a further step in this incremental series of movements towards independence, yes.
The endorsement of violence in the struggle against imperialism and its lackeys, including Sihanouk, does that have any significance from the perspective of evolution of policy or principles by the party?
It's more explicit than what they've said before, but they had talked about all forms of struggle earlier on. So now you're saying armed violence, revolutionary violence, modern revisionism, Khrushchev's ideas about the parliamentary road to power. Well, Sihanouk had closed that off because he was not willing to allow a space for the opposition. So in a way, to some extent, they were forced into using violence because that was the only option available. But yes, and we will come to it in a minute, I'm sure, it would then lead to revolutionary violence.
Thank you. Another development that seems to be occurring at this point in time is a view of countryside vis-a-vis the city and some of the difficulties that the party was experiencing in your description in recruiting cadre in the cities. This is at page 149, and the ERNs are 00639-632, French 00639-649. And the quote is as follows: the Cambodian party's inability to penetrate the country's nascent proletariat was to have far-reaching consequences. Sarr and his colleagues did not ask themselves what they were doing wrong. Instead, in a pattern of behaviour that would be repeated whenever they were faced with failure, by 1965, they decided that the factories had been infiltrated and the workers transformed into enemy agents. From then on, factory workers were systematically refused admission to the party. Can I ask you to expand on that phenomenon of inability to infiltrate factories and what you describe as an evolving view vis-à-vis the cities and workers?
I think at this stage it was particularly a view of the working class, the proletariat. If you look at other communist parties, without exception, they have recruited among the proletariat. The whole raison d'etre of communism, of a Marxist approach to policy, as Marx proclaimed it, was based on industry, on the Industrial Revolution. And the Cambodian communists took the view that the workers had basically been bought off by the bosses, that they were not reliable. And instead of asking themselves why, they, as you've read, they took the view that they had been infiltrated. And this was a systematic pattern because we see later, instead of asking themselves after 1975 what was going wrong in the Cambodian countryside, why they were not getting the yields that they expected, why agricultural production was not developing as expected, they put it all down to sabotage by Vietnamese agents. So this mindset, the principles must be right. Therefore, if they're not working, they're being sabotaged by outside. That was already present in the 1960s.
Thank you. We then move forward to the 1966 period and elections that took place in 1966, following which Lon Nol formed a government that's been described as a right-wing government. And here the Central Committee makes certain decisions or resolutions with respect to that government. And I'm only quoting here, again, because I wish to ask you as to whether or not this is a further development of relevance. This starts at page 1. It's at page 164. The English ERN is 00396364 and French 006396669. The background to this passage is the developments in Indonesia and the fate of the Indonesian Communist Party. But we're going to look at what the policy or the principles were or implications were for the CPK. Quote, the lesson for Sarr was that the bourgeoisie could not be relied on. The Vietnamese strategy was wrong. It was not possible for the communists to live together with Sihanouk because the contradictions between them were too deep. Policy towards non-party sympathisers was therefore modified. In theory, the guideline remained to unite with all those who could be united with. But in practice, the movement behaved more and more as though all those who are not with us are against us. Khieu Samphan, Hu Yun and Hu Nim, who had kept their seats in the September elections, began to distance themselves from the prince. It marked the start of the politics of exclusion that would become one of the hallmarks of the Cambodian party's style. From now on, the CPK required its supporters to draw a clear line of demarcation between the enemy and ourselves. So we heard in your previous response a description of this refusal to look to one's own actions with a critical eye, perhaps. And now we have this further development, it appears, of a principle with respect to those outside being viewed as enemies. Do I take it correctly, then, that this is another development and that there is a thread which then follows in the years after?
It's another increment. And yes, I think one of the most striking things is when you look back at the way the party developed, there is a very clear thread with this event happening and then another event, and it all moves it on, but always in the same sense.
And I think your book paints that picture in a very nice and detailed manner. Just returning to this passage, you state that Khieu Samphan and Hu Yun and Hu Nim began to distance themselves from the prince. Mindful of the fact that this is late 1966, presumably, and that Pol Pot, part of the leadership, had already left Phnom Penh, do I infer correctly from that passage that there is still some degree of communication, cooperation? I'll let you use the words that you think appropriate, but you seem to describe an action on the part of Khieu Samphan that is consistent with this evolution.
Consistent with is a good way of putting it. One of the difficulties is to know exactly how the interface between Khieu Samphan, Hu Nim and Hu Yun and the CPK core, the city committee, how that operated, how the links worked, but that there was a linkage in the way they operated is certain.
Thank you. And just to follow up on this, and please, if you think I'm taking you into the realm of speculation, then simply don't answer. Do I take it from your previous response that there is a connection between the action of these men in Phnom Penh and what is being decided in the countryside? There is, in other words, these were not sporadic events that occurred divorced from one another and happened to just be happening at the same time.
No, they were certainly not sporadic and divorced from each other. But to go from there to saying there was a direct linkage, I think it's probably not correct, but it's certainly a step one can't take.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to disappoint you a little bit and skip the uprising, simply because it has been covered to a degree, and perhaps we might deal with it as part of other topics. But I will fast forward a little bit and deal with events in 1970. And here, we've already heard some evidence from you as to the creation of the United Front coalition with Sihanouk, so I will not rehash that. But I wish to focus on another aspect of this period, or another series of events. And if you're looking at the book, the relevant passages are at page 202, and then it actually continues all the way to 205. What you're describing there is I think, a challenge, and you will correct me if I've got this wrong, arising from military victories that at this point in time are being attained by the Vietnamese forces, and a challenge that, in your view, if I've got this right, that this poses for the communist leadership in Cambodia. and you describe that the Vietnamese had, by this stage, already occupied several provinces, the Vietnamese forces, that is. At page, I think this is at 204, English ERN 00396-404 and French 00639-719, you say the following: for Sa and his colleagues, this posed a real dilemma. On the one hand, the more territory the Vietnamese seized, the more recruits there would be for the resistance army, and the bigger the liberated zones for the Khmer Rouges to administer. On the other hand, the CPK leaders were acutely aware of the danger of going too fast. Quote, they told us, in effect, end of quote, a Vietnamese historian wrote later, quote, if you, our brothers, help us to do everything too quickly, we won't be able to keep up with you, and then the moment you leave, we will have nothing. On page 205, I'll just read a very brief passage from this, so this is the next page. You say the following: the ancestral dread of Vietnamese domination shared by Sihanouk and Lon Nol emerged in 1970 as one of the driving forces of CPK policy. Would you care to expand on this? And have I got the first quote right? Is it of relevance in the sense that the victories in the battlefield by the Vietnamese posed a challenge for the Khmer Rouge leadership, but if I understand your description of this correctly, that was driven again by a fear of Vietnamese domination.
There was, yes, there was a fear of Vietnamese domination, and that was very important. But I think one has to remember that at the time of the coup, there were only about 2,000, and even that may be an optimistic estimate. 2,000 Cambodian guerrillas fighting against Lon Nol's forces. It's a very small number. If the imbalance between those 2,000, even if new recruits were flocking in, they weren't trained, they weren't integrated, the imbalance between the Khmer forces and the very well-trained, battle-hardened Vietnamese detachments who had moved into Cambodia and were occupying larger areas of Cambodian territory was enormous. So even without the ancestral, what I've called the ancestral fear of Vietnamese domination, Pol Pot had a real problem. How do we keep our end up? How do we hold up our flag if we are so few and there are so many and there's such a huge area? But added to that, the Vietnamese did many things which reawakened old fears of domination. Most obviously the suggestion that they should have mixed commands and Vietnamese officers with Khmer officers supporting them. All these things were red flags to Pol Pot and the Cambodians. So the two things came together, the practical aspect and the fear of Vietnamese domination, which, you look back to 1954 when the Cambodians had been doing really not badly. The Geneva Conference came, the Vietnamese did a very nice deal for themselves, and the poor Cambodian Isaraka kind of left high and dry. This had happened before.
Thank you, and we probably will be returning to this issue of relationship with Vietnam as we go forward. But then going chronologically, you describe another phenomenon or development. This is at page 210. And at this point, of course, we're in 1970, so the Civil War is underway. The English ERN here is 00396-410 and French 00639-726-7. you say the following: the slide over the edge of reason into the abyss was not confined to the regime in Phnom Penh. If to Lon Nol's government all Vietnamese were communists, to the Khmer Rouge all foreigners were enemies. By the end of April, 26 Western journalists had gone missing in Cambodia. Those fortunate enough to end up in the hands of the Viet Cong were usually freed, as was the practice in Vietnam, at a moment of maximum political advantage to their captors. With 3 exceptions, all those captured during the war by the Khmer Rouge, priests and aid personnel as well as journalists were killed. Once again, it was a matter of drawing a clear line of demarcation between the enemy and ourselves. Is that a further increment or development in the view we were discussing earlier as to enemies and ourselves and the treatment of that enemy?
Whether it's a development or whether it's simply the continuation of the same thing, because we talked earlier about after 1966, after the Lon Nol government came to power, the Khmer Rouge or the CPK increasingly took the view all who are not with us are against us. Well, all who are not with us are against us means clear line between the enemy and ourselves. It's all of a package, I think.
Were those...
President, thank you, the prosecutor, and thank you, Mr. Expert. The time is appropriate for a short break. We will take a 20-minute break and return at 10 to 11. Court officer, could you assist the expert during the break and have him return to the courtroom at 10 to 11. The court is now adjourned.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ